So before that, I need to use a conceptual framework that everyone, at least within IR, knows exactly what we're gonna discuss. In this case, I use the term or notion middle power, right? But the problem with the middle power concept is that it heavily relies on traditional middle power when it comes to its conceptualization, right? 20 years of research agenda in middle power focus more on the Canada experience, Australia experience, and to some extent, um, North Europe or Western Europe kind of a middle power like a Norway, a Netherlands, and so on and so forth. But the way how this traditional middle power, in terms of its nature, in terms of its economic development, and also in terms of its democratic alignment, is kind of a different. So we need to create a new kind of tools to understand fully the notion of emerging middle power. Okay, next thing. So here's the thing. Conventional wisdom focus more on three approach. Obviously, for those who are in IR, knows exactly what is the new realist, neoliberal institutionalist, as well as constructivist, right? Obviously, neorealist is a very straightforward. Neoliberal is very straightforward. They always see expansive behavior of emerging middle power primarily can be explained through the notion of structural constraint, right? Due to the change in system dynamic within international systems, push or provide an opportunity for country like emerging middle power to further engage in a global level. That is the very conventional understanding of middle power. Or perhaps, yeah, neoliberal institutionalists focus more on how dependency on the pursuit of national interests as well as their survival allows middle power to engage more in international order, right? This is a very conventional understanding of middle power. A growing number of literature focus more on the constructivist side, where basically middle power is not about whether you are a middle power, but whether you are identified as a middle power. So it's not about uh, objective reality of being a middle power, having this kind of a GDP per capita, or having this kind of a expansive or good citizen diplomacy. It's not about that. It's about more about whether you identify yourself as a middle power and you took that identification forward. So this kind of a new understanding of conventional middle power. Next. But for me, there is a critics on such conventional wisdom. First, they focus more on the state level. They tried, or they to some extent, uh, black boxing the state, right? It's straightforward, it's easy, it's a parsimonious explanation, but at the same time, it's boring. It doesn't really provide you with a very insightful understanding of why particular emerging middle power choose these particular roles, but not the others, right? It seems that the motivation are all the same: survival of the fittest and structure of international system. The same goes with constructivism. It is explaining to what extent a country identify itself as a middle power, but it doesn't really explain the process within um, micro or meso level of why a particular identity is absorbed while such identity is not really uh, implemented within a particular foreign policy. So for me, there is a gap in the literature suggesting that middle power should not be treated as a fixed concept or categorization, but rather is a more of a construct being pursued by policymakers. Next. Here, in this book, I propose a new kind of a approach focusing on a mid-range theory. Yeah, I propose the notion of role theory is a very uh, old theory in sociology, in symbolic interactionist literature. I took that from sociologists, from psychologists, and tried to apply it into the discussion of international relations, particularly foreign policy of emerging middle power. Why should we use this kind of a theory. Basically, there are three kind of a motivation for me to use this kind of a concept of role theory. First, it has been widely used in foreign policy, but not so much in international relation literature. Secondly, the notions of role conception allows us as an IR scholars to engage as well with the mid-range theory, such as biographical narrative, if you heard about this concept by Jennifer Mitson, yeah, ontological security, yeah, state transformation. So there are growing numbers of concepts within the last 10 years, yeah, focusing on explaining the behavior of the state, but it's not really explaining particularly middle power. It's explaining in general terms a state behavior. But somehow this concept should be connected to the discussion of role theory. So for me, having role conception allows me to speak to these literatures and then try to synthesize it in a way that allows me to understand further about emerging middle power. Doing so, at least the third aspect is basically capturing both the agential and structural levels of analysis in understanding emerging middle powers. Next. So here's the arguments in brief. First, I identify four overarching role conceptions that were enacted by the Indonesian government in the post-authoritarian period, yeah, up all the way until Joko Widodo administration. There are four roles that Indonesia wanted to present, right? The first, obviously, voice for developing countries, regional leader, yeah, advocate of democratic and human rights norms, as well as a bridge builder. And not only that, in this paper, I also advanced the arguments about the importance of role playing as a notion, as well as role conflict. So these are two concepts that I bring forward to the literature, to the literature, yeah, role playing stage. So basically, I situate regional audiences, international audiences, or international level and regional level as role playing stage. It basically, is an arena for role playing for the state. Next. So what is role basically, right? In this paper, I conceptualize role as in three aspects. First, role as a actor's cognitive structure, their own position into role. So basically, there is an agency. Right? Actors cognitively structure their own position into roles that they aim to enact, right? That's the first understanding of role. The second is role is a result of how actors learn to react in a given situation. So it's not strategically enacted, but more about a result of how actors learn. So there is a learning aspect in roles. Role is not only cognitively, but it's also a learning process. And thirdly, roles are used by actors as a resource for interaction. So in this case, role can also be a strategic tool for interacting with other country in a given situation. These are roles in the conceptualization of in the book, yeah? The next question will be, what is the source of roles, right? So there are two source of role. First, what I call as an ego understanding of the self, yeah? Basically, ego expectation, yeah? Ego expectation basically capture the domestic driven factors in influencing the construction of role conception. The second one, the source of role conception, is basically what I call as self or outer expectation, yeah? It covers, yeah, international source of roles such as expectation of other government, legal norms expressed through custom and treaties, as well as the dominant source such as human rights, yeah, democracy. This could be also what we call an outer expectation. Now, moving forward, yeah, in this book, I also try to distinguish between identity and roles, yeah, because sometimes people think that roles and identities are all the same, but in this book, I argue they are not the same, right? First, indeed, roles supply actors with a sense of meaningful self. So yes, roles to some extent allows you to have your identity, yeah? And roles are expectation attached to position while identities are basically internalized role conception. So it may sound the same, but basically a role's more about identity is more about how you internalize such role conception into yourself, right? The third one, actors have general understanding of the existing social position, but try to make the performance of the role unique to themselves, right? So they try to use role as something that differentiate them with other state, yeah? And also, roles are only loosely prescribing appropriate behavior. Actors have more flexibility to individualize the performance, right? So even though we have the same roles like advocate of democracy, but the way how we performatize it or try to perform it, yeah, might be a little bit different, depending on what is your audience, yeah. And last but not least, roles are a constitutive part of identity formation, but they can also be a strategic instrument to maintain a coherent biographical narrative. So, so these are probably the abstract or conceptual abstractions of roles and identity that I want to discuss in this book. Last but not least, probably uh, conceptualizing role conflict. So, in enacting roles, you will definitely face what I call as a role conflict. So what is role conflict? When role conflict appear, right? For definition, role expectation from others are vague or inconsistent. There is a lack of resource to fill the role. State face diverging norms and expectation. So they have a norms and they have expectation, and somehow they diverge, and then it creates role conflict. And last but not least, there is an incompatibility between the interests of the state and its external expectation in international relation. Next, so I won't bother you with this this slide. Basically, the slide discuss about how different audiences creates conflict in role enactment. Next. And there's also stage and outcomes of role conflict. So there is a role conflict when it's still in the first stage, and there is a second stage role conflict, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go into detail. Probably next slide. So that kind of a discussion of roles and identity and role conflict, I tried to implement it in 4 case study. Yeah, why 4 case studies? Because these 4 case studies basically showcase 2 level of audiences, regional and international audiences, and into issue. Yeah, democracy and human rights issue, as well as economic cooperation and trade. I chose 4 platforms here. In terms of global and in issue of human rights, I focus on UN Human Rights Council. When it comes to issue of trade, but it's in the global level, I focus on WTO. At the regional level, when it comes to democracy, I focus on ASEAN, Bali Democracy Forum. While in economic and cooperation and trade, I focus on AAC, ASEAN Economic Community, and also RCEP. So is also a lot of cases in order to illustrate the conceptualization of roles and identity as well as role conflict. Next. My finding is that, probably I'm not going to go into detail about the book. So basically, in terms of Indonesia and human rights governance, at the regional level, the role has been mobilized. Yeah, the role of regional leader has been mobilized. But at the global level, the role of advocate of democracy has not been fully enacted, particularly in regard to Indonesia involvement in Human Rights Council. So I find that even though you have the same role, which is advocate of democracy, but the way how you enact the role at the regional and global level is completely different, right? I try to elucidate it in the book, how Indonesia, in the case of Myanmar, for instance, in a regional level, it seems to be a staunch proponent of Western liberal approach on democracy, but in the UN Human Rights Council, somehow such agenda of Western liberal democracy is somehow vanished in the way how Indonesia enact its role. The same also in the role of bridge builder is heavily enacted in both level, regional and global level, but the tone and rhetoric are all different. Yeah. In regard to global human rights governance, arguably Indonesia seems to act as a voice for developing countries by challenging Western criticism. So it's kind of a difficult how in the regional level Indonesia try to emulate Western norms, yeah, try to be kind of a norm entrepreneur in the region, but at the global level, such and norm entrepreneurial seems to vanish and focus more on the global South agenda. Next, in terms of trade governance, it's also has a very interesting finding. Yeah, Indonesia attempt to enact role of advocate of trade liberalization, but somehow there is a pushback from the domestic audiences. As a result, at the regional level, Indonesia is reluctant to lead the regional economic integration. So usually it's Singapore, it's Malaysia, Indonesia kind of sitting in the fence, yeah, following what Singapore and Malaysia has done for increasing regional economic integration. However, Indonesia role as a voice for developing countries is the main feature of its role at the global level, especially in WTO. Next. So, what is the implication for this policy implication, so to speak, on Indonesia engagement in regional and global governance? This book offers four. Yeah. First, Indonesia engagement in strengthening democracy and human rights will always be constrained because this kind of a role conflict happening at the regional and the global level. Secondly, Indonesia's engagement in the global human rights mechanism, particularly in Human Rights Council, is likely to continue its ambivalent approach in regard to strengthening and promoting human rights. Third, Indonesia engagement in AAC, ASEAN Economic Community, will continue to be legitimized through Indonesia role conception as a regional leader. So it's not so much that Indonesia believe in the trade liberalization or regional integration, is particularly because it has a role to be a regional leader. As a result, it has to push the idea of a growing regional integration. And last but not least, Indonesia engagement in WTO remain characterized by its rhetoric of enhancing trade liberalization and will remain a venue for enacting its role conception as a bridge builder and a voice for developing countries. Next, conclusion. So this book, obviously, hopefully able to make a substantive contribution to different strands of literature, at least first, role theory literatures that I'm interested in, and secondly, Indonesian foreign policy. Yeah. And secondly, I hope that this book able to introduce role theory approach to the study of emerging power. Indeed, there's still a limitation. Obviously, at the beginning, this book attempt to create kind of a new theory or new approach from non-Western IR theory. But it turns out, yeah, I'm still emulating, yeah, Western theory through notion of roles, yeah, identity, and so on. Apparently, it's really difficult task to create kind of a global IR, having your own non-Western IR theory. Yeah, so this is kind of a, I hope that this work will provide more stepping stone, yeah, for IR research in order to able to theorize, yeah, state behavior from the experience of the global South. I think that's all from me. Thank you, Praga. Thank you all. Looking forward for your question and feedback. Thank you.